October 31st, 1845. St. Dymphna's Catholic Church, Monaghan Town, Ireland. When Father Brennan O'Sullivan failed to appear for morning mass, the parish sexton Michael Doherty entered the vestry with growing concern. What he discovered in the pre-dawn darkness would haunt him until his dying day. Father O'Sullivan lay sprawled across the stone floor, his cassock torn open, his flesh a pallid gray that seemed to glow in the weak morning light. His eyes were open, staring upward at the vaulted ceiling where hundreds, perhaps thousands, of bats clung to the ancient rafters, their leathery wings folded against their bodies, their small eyes reflecting the candle flame like tiny mirrors. But it was the priest's throat that seized Doherty's attention. 2 puncture wounds, small and precise, marked the left side of his neck. And when the local physician Dr. James McCarthy arrived an hour later, he made a pronouncement that would send tremors through the entire county. Father O'Sullivan had been completely exsanguinated. Not a drop of blood remained in his body. The villagers whispered one word: vampire. But the truth was far more terrifying than any folklore could imagine. Before we uncover the truth about the Monaghan Church Bats and the mysterious death of Father O'Sullivan, a case that would shake the foundations of Irish Catholicism and expose a darkness that had been breeding in the rafters for decades, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers, so tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Now, let's descend into one of Ireland's most disturbing historical mysteries. Ireland in 1845 existed in a state of profound tension. The Great Famine had just begun its merciless grip on the island, with potato blight destroying the primary food source for millions of Irish peasants. In County Monaghan, a predominantly Catholic region along the border with Ulster, the desperation was palpable. Families who had lived on their land for generations watched their crops turn black and putrid in the fields. Children went to bed hungry. The elderly began to sicken and die. But in Monaghan town itself, a prosperous market center, the catastrophe had not yet fully struck. The town's Anglo-Irish Protestant elite lived in comfortable Georgian homes along the Dublin Road, while the Catholic majority clustered in the narrow lanes around the Diamond, the town's central square. St. Dymphna's Church stood on the northern edge of town, a medieval structure that had survived the Reformation, the Cromwellian conquest, and the penal laws. Its thick stone walls and narrow Gothic windows spoke to an age when churches were built as much for defense as for worship. Father Brennan O'Sullivan had served as St. Dymphna's priest for 12 years. At 43, he was considered a moderate man, neither a firebrand nationalist nor a collaborator with Protestant authorities. His parishioners described him as contemplative, scholarly, and deeply committed to the poor. He spoke fluent Latin and Irish, and his sermons drew upon both Catholic theology and Celtic mythology in ways that resonated with the townspeople. He was unmarried, as his vocation required, and lived simply in the small stone rectory adjacent to the church. The church itself was ancient, with portions dating to the 13th century. The bell tower rose 70 feet above the town, and locals swore they could hear the bells from 5 miles away on still nights. But it was the church's interior that captured visitors' attention. The vaulted ceiling soared 40 feet overhead, supported by carved stone pillars depicting saints and biblical scenes. The rafters were massive oak beams, blackened with age and smoke from centuries of candles. And in those rafters, since anyone could remember, the bats had lived. They were common pipistrelle bats, small creatures weighing no more than a few grams each. During the day, they hung in clusters in the darkest corners of the ceiling. At dusk, they would emerge in clouds, pouring out through gaps in the masonry to hunt insects over the surrounding fields. The parishioners had grown accustomed to their presence. Some even considered them a blessing. They kept the mosquitoes and midges at bay during the humid summer months. Father O'Sullivan himself had once preached that God's creatures came in many forms, and that the bats were simply another part of creation deserving of respect and protection. But in the autumn of 1845, something changed. Several parishioners later reported that the bat colony had grown substantially that year. Where once there might have been a few hundred bats, there now seemed to be thousands. They filled not just the rafters, but every nook and cranny of the church's upper reaches. The smell of their guano became overpowering, a sharp ammonia stench that permeated the sanctuary. Mrs. Bridget Callahan, who cleaned the church twice weekly, complained to Father O'Sullivan that the accumulation of droppings had become unmanageable. She found the bats unsettling, she said, They watched her with their tiny eyes as she worked. Father O'Sullivan had promised to address the situation, but he never got the chance. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came 3 weeks before Father O'Sullivan's death. On October 8, 1845, a local farmer named Seamus McGrath brought his 7-year-old daughter Eileen to the church for confession. As they waited in the nave, Eileen suddenly screamed. When her father rushed to her, she was clutching her neck, blood seeping between her small fingers. A bat had apparently swooped down from the rafters and bitten her. Father O'Sullivan emerged from the confessional, his face pale with concern. He examined the wound, 2 small punctures on the child's throat, and immediately sent for Dr. McCarthy. The physician cleaned and dressed the wound, pronouncing it minor but unusual. Bats don't typically attack humans, he told the gathering crowd of concerned parishioners. They're insectivores. This is highly irregular behavior. He recommended that the church be temporarily closed until the bat problem could be addressed. Father O'Sullivan reluctantly agreed, canceling evening services for the next week. But the priest could not stay away from his church. Witnesses reported seeing candlelight in the sanctuary late at night, and Michael Doherty, the sexton, said that Father O'Sullivan had become obsessed with studying the bats. The priest had obtained several books on natural history from Dublin and spent hours observing the colony's behavior. He took extensive notes in a leather journal, documenting their feeding patterns, their social hierarchies, their reproduction cycles. He was fascinated, Doherty would later testify, but it was more than scientific interest. He seemed troubled, haunted even. He kept saying there was something wrong with them, something unnatural. He said they were watching him. The second incident occurred on October 19th. Father O'Sullivan was preparing for evening vespers when he discovered a dead cat in the church vestry. The animal belonged to Mrs. Callahan, who had last seen it the previous morning. The cat's throat had been torn open, and like little Eileen McGrath, it appeared to have been bitten multiple times. But what disturbed Father O'Sullivan most was the state of the corpse. It had been completely drained of blood. The fur was pristine, showing no signs of a struggle, but the flesh beneath was pallid and shrunken, as if the animal had been dead for weeks rather than hours. Father O'Sullivan sent word to Dr. McCarthy once again. When the physician examined the cat, he found himself at a loss for explanation. "The wounds are consistent with bite marks," he wrote in his medical journal, "but the complete exsanguination is inexplicable. No predator I know of feeds in such a manner. The puncture wounds are too small and too precise. It's as if the blood was methodically extracted rather than consumed in the heat of a kill." The doctor recommended that Father O'Sullivan bring in an exterminator to remove the bat colony immediately. Our days before his death, Father O'Sullivan held a private meeting with Bishop Patrick McMahon, who had traveled from Clogher to address concerns about the priest's behavior. What transpired during that meeting remained secret for over a decade, until Bishop McMahon's private papers were discovered after his death in 1857. According to the bishop's account, Father O'Sullivan was in a state of profound agitation. He had barricaded himself in the rectory and initially refused to open the door. When he finally admitted the bishop, McMahon was shocked by what he saw. The rectory was in chaos. Books lay scattered across every surface. Candles burned in every corner. And on the walls, the priest had drawn elaborate diagrams, maps of the church's architecture, anatomical drawings of bats, strange symbols that appeared to be neither Christian nor pagan, but something altogether more arcane. Father O'Sullivan grabbed the bishop's arm with surprising strength. "They're not bats," he said, his voice hoarse and desperate. "They never were. They're vessels, carriers. Something came here centuries ago, something that learned to hide in these creatures, to move from body to body, generation to generation. It's been feeding on this congregation for hundreds of years, taking just enough that no one noticed. A little blood here, a little life force there. But now it's growing stronger, it's growing hungry, and it wants to be free." Bishop McMahon tried to calm the priest, suggesting that exhaustion and stress had overtaken his judgment. He offered to arrange for Father O'Sullivan to take a leave of absence, to rest and recover his strength. But the priest refused. He insisted that he alone understood the danger, that he alone could stop what was coming. He had to stay in the church, he said. He had to keep watch. "If I leave," Father O'Sullivan whispered, "it will spread. It will move to another church, another colony. It will find new hosts. This ends here in St. Dymphna's, or it never ends at all." The bishop left that night deeply troubled. He wrote in his journal, "Father O'Sullivan has succumbed to some manner of religious mania. Whether this is the result of spiritual crisis, mental illness, or something more sinister, I cannot say. I fear for his immortal soul. It was the last time anyone saw Father Brennan O'Sullivan alive. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, because what happens next would challenge everything the people of Monaghan thought they knew about the natural world, and about the thin boundary between faith and madness. Let's discover what authorities found in that church. October 31st, 1845. All Hallows' Eve, a date the Irish had long associated with the thinning of the veil between worlds. Michael Doherty arrived at St. Dymphna's at 5 o'clock in the morning, as was his custom, to prepare the church for morning mass. The sun had not yet risen, and a thick mist clung to the streets of Monaghan town. As he approached the church, Doherty noticed something odd. The front door stood slightly ajar, which was unusual, as Father O'Sullivan always locked it at night. A faint light flickered from within, candles burning in the sanctuary. Doherty entered cautiously, calling out for the priest. No response came. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Even the bats, usually active at dawn, were completely still in the rafters above. Doherty made his way toward the vestry, where Father O'Sullivan prepared for services. And there, sprawled across the cold stone floor, he found the priest's body. Later, in his sworn testimony to the Royal Irish Constabulary, Doherty described the scene with remarkable precision, despite his obvious distress. Father O'Sullivan lay on his back, his arms outstretched as if in crucifixion. His cassock had been torn open from neck to waist, exposing his chest and throat. His flesh was the color of marble, pure white, almost luminous in the candlelight. His eyes were open and staring upward at the ceiling, at the bats hanging there in their thousands. His expression, God help me, his expression was one of absolute terror. But it was the wounds that defied explanation. 2 small puncture marks, no larger than nail holes, pierced the left side of Father O'Sullivan's neck, approximately 2 inches below the jaw. The edges of the wounds were clean, almost surgical in their precision. There was no blood on the floor, no blood on his clothing, no blood anywhere. The priest had been drained completely. Doherty ran screaming into the street, alerting the town watch. Within the hour, a crowd had gathered outside the church, whispering and crossing themselves. Dr. James McCarthy arrived shortly after 6 o'clock. What he documented in his examination would become one of the most controversial medical reports in Irish history. Dr. McCarthy noted that the body exhibited no signs of rigor mortis, despite clearly being dead for several hours based on the body's temperature. The skin was not merely pale but appeared to have been leached of all color, including the underlying red tones that normally persist even after death. When McCarthy attempted to draw blood from the priest's arm for examination, his lance had produced nothing, not even a drop. The veins and arteries were completely empty, collapsed inward upon themselves. The puncture wounds on the neck showed evidence of careful, deliberate feeding. Under magnification, McCarthy could see tiny teeth marks, arranged in a pattern consistent with the dental structure of a small mammal. The wounds penetrated approximately 1 inch deep, puncturing the carotid artery. Death would have come slowly over the course of hours, as the priest's blood was methodically extracted. But the most disturbing finding came when McCarthy examined the priest's hands. Father O'Sullivan's fingernails were broken and bloody. Splinters of wood were embedded beneath them. The palms bore deep scratches and abrasions. He had been fighting something, struggling desperately, but there were no defensive wounds on his arms or chest. Whatever had killed him had held him in place, immobilized him while it fed. McCarthy turned his attention to the church itself. The floor of the vestry was covered in a thick layer of bat guano, far more than could have accumulated in a few weeks. When he examined it closely, he made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. Mixed in with the droppings were small fragments of organic matter, tissue, skin, what appeared to be scraps of clothing. It was as if the bats had been feeding on something, or someone, for far longer than anyone realized. Then McCarthy looked up at the ceiling. The bats were completely still, packed so densely in some areas that the rafters were no longer visible. And when he held his candle higher, he saw that dozens of the creatures were bloated, their abdomens distended to twice their normal size. They hung heavy on the beams, too engorged to fly. One of the constables who entered the church with McCarthy later testified, "The doctor turned to me, his face white as death, and said, 'We need to evacuate this building immediately. Whatever happened here is not finished.' As if in response to his words, a single bat detached from the ceiling, then another. spent an entire day examining the church from the outside, observing the bats as they emerged at dusk to hunt. He noted their species, common pipistrelles as expected, and their behavior, which appeared normal. They flew in their characteristic erratic patterns, catching insects in mid-air, returning to the church before dawn. Nothing about their external behavior suggested anything unusual. But when Blackwood entered the church on November 4th, accompanied by Inspector Hawthorne and 2 constables carrying torches, he immediately recognized that something was profoundly wrong. The smell alone was overwhelming, a mixture of ammonia, decay, and something else, something organic and rotten that Blackwood couldn't immediately identify. The guano on the floor was indeed far deeper than could be explained by a few weeks of accumulation. In some areas, it had built up to nearly 6 inches deep. Blackwood began to excavate the guano carefully, layer by layer, documenting what he found. The deeper he went, the older the material became, compressed and hardened by time. And mixed throughout were those disturbing organic fragments, bone, hair, scraps of fabric. When Blackwood had dug down approximately 3 feet, he made a discovery that stopped him cold. A human skull, small and delicate, a child's skull. The excavation was immediately halted. Inspector Hawthorne brought in a team of laborers to carefully remove all of the guano from the church floor. What they uncovered over the next week would horrify the entire county and beyond. Buried beneath decades, perhaps centuries, of bat droppings were the remains of at least 17 individuals. Most were children. The oldest bones dated back approximately 200 years, based on the style of clothing fragments found with them. The most recent was a young woman, identified by her jewelry as Mary Brennan, who had disappeared from Monaghan town in 1832, 13 years earlier. Each skeleton bore the same distinctive marks, puncture wounds on the neck, precise and deliberate. The bones themselves were oddly porous, as if the marrow had been extracted. Professor Blackwood, examining the remains with growing horror, theorized that the victims had been killed slowly, over the course of days or weeks, their blood gradually drained while they were kept alive and conscious. But how? And by whom? Or what? The answer came from Father O'Sullivan's journal, which was found in the rectory. The priest had been conducting his own investigation, compiling historical records and folklore from the region. What he discovered was a pattern that stretched back to the church's founding in the 13th century. St. Dymphna's had always had bats, always had disappearances. Parish records going back to 1243 mentioned parishioners who had vanished in the night, often around religious holidays. Local folklore spoke of a curse placed on the church during the medieval period, something to do with a monk who had practiced dark arts, who had sought to achieve immortality through unholy means. The monk's name had been lost to time, but the stories persisted. He had made a pact with something ancient, something that predated Christianity itself, and he had bound that entity to the church, trapped it in the bodies of the bats that roosted there. Father O'Sullivan had concluded that the entity, whatever it was, fed on blood and life force. It could only act through its hosts, the bats, and only within the confines of the church. For centuries it had taken victims slowly and carefully, never enough to draw attention, always leaving room for doubt. A missing child could be explained as drowning, or running away, or being taken by wolves. But as the colony grew larger, as more bats became infected or possessed or whatever the proper term was, the entity's hunger had grown. It had begun to take more risks, to feed more openly, and Father O'Sullivan had attempted to stop it. The priest's final journal entries, written in an increasingly erratic hand, described a plan. He would enter the church on All Hallows' Eve, the night when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and he would confront the entity directly. He would offer himself as a sacrifice, willingly giving his blood and his life, but in doing so, he would bind the entity once more, trap it, weaken it. He had prepared a ritual drawn from both Catholic exorcism rites and older pagan ceremonies. He had blessed the church with holy water and salt. He had arranged candles in specific patterns, creating a sacred geometry designed to contain malevolent forces. But something had gone wrong. The entity had been too strong, too clever. It had overwhelmed the priest before he could complete the ritual. And in consuming Father O'Sullivan, it had grown more powerful than ever before. Inspector Hawthorne, reading the journal, faced an impossible decision. He was a man of reason, a representative of British law and order. He did not believe in curses or demons or blood-drinking spirits that inhabited bats. But he could not deny the evidence before him: 17 bodies, buried for centuries. A priest drained of every drop of blood, and thousands of bats that showed no sign of leaving their sanctuary. November 10, 1845, Hawthorne made his choice. He ordered the church burned. The decision was controversial, sparking outrage among the Catholic population of Monaghan town. Bishop McMahon traveled from Clogher to protest, arguing that the church was a sacred space that should not be destroyed. But Hawthorne was adamant. He had consulted with Professor Blackwood, who confirmed that there was no known method to safely relocate or exterminate a colony of this size. The only way to ensure that whatever inhabited those bats could not spread was to destroy them completely on. The night of November 12th, constables surrounded St. Dymphna's church. They sealed every opening except one, into which they poured oil and pitch. Then, as a crowd of hundreds watched from a safe distance, they set the church ablaze. The fire burned for 3 days. Witnesses reported hearing sounds from within the inferno, not the screeching of bats, but something else. Something that sounded almost like laughter, or screaming, or both at once. The flames rose 100 feet into the air, visible from miles away. When the fire finally burned itself out, nothing remained but blackened stone walls and ash. Inspector Hawthorne ordered the ruins sealed and placed under guard. A new church was built half a mile away, on ground that had been blessed by Bishop McMahon himself. The site of St. Dymphna's was left to nature, gradually overgrown by thorns and ivy. But the story did not end there. The Monaghan Church Bats case sent shockwaves through both scientific and religious communities across Europe. Professor Blackwood published a controversial paper in 1847 titled On the Anomalous Behavior of Chiroptera in Ecclesiastical Environments, which documented the physical evidence while carefully avoiding any supernatural conclusions. The paper was largely dismissed by his peers, and Blackwood's academic reputation never recovered. He died in 1851, at age 56, reportedly having destroyed all of his research notes on the Monaghan case. Dr. James McCarthy was more circumspect. He published a brief medical report describing Father O'Sullivan's death as resulting from exsanguination via unknown means, but declined to speculate on the cause. In private correspondence, discovered years later, however, McCarthy admitted that the case had shaken his faith in purely naturalistic explanations for phenomena. "There are things in this world," he wrote to a colleague in 1849, "that science cannot yet explain, and perhaps never will. We must have the humility to acknowledge the limits of our understanding." The Catholic Church's response was to bury the incident as deeply as possible. Bishop McMahon wrote a brief official account that attributed Father O'Sullivan's death to natural causes and made no mention of the bodies found beneath the church floor. The families of the victims were quietly informed and compensated, but sworn to secrecy. The church's archive contained no record of the events beyond a single line in the diocesan register. St. Dymphna's Church, Monaghan, town, destroyed by fire November 1845. Cause unknown. But the people of Monaghan remembered. For generations afterward, they told stories about the Church of the Bats, about Father O'Sullivan's final sacrifice, about the evil that had lurked in the rafters for centuries. Parents warned their children to stay away from the ruins. Travelers passing through the town gave the site a wide berth, and on certain nights, particularly on All Hallows' Eve, locals reported seeing strange lights flickering among the blackened stones, and hearing sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. The case also sparked a broader investigation into mysterious deaths associated with bat colonies and churches across Ireland and Britain. Between 1846 and 1850, authorities examined records from over 300 parishes and found a disturbing pattern. Churches with large bat populations showed statistically higher rates of unexplained disappearances and deaths than those without. In at least 15 cases, authorities discovered hidden remains buried beneath guano deposits, suggesting that the Monaghan incident was not unique. This led to a widespread campaign to remove bat colonies from religious buildings. Thousands of bats were killed across Ireland and England during this period, often by setting fires or introducing poisons. Conservationists today regard this as an ecological catastrophe that devastated bat populations for decades. But at the time, it was seen as a necessary public health measure. The scientific community struggled to explain the Monaghan case within existing frameworks. Some theorized that the bats had been infected with a form of rabies that altered their behavior, making them aggressive and driving them to attack humans. Others suggested that the church's architecture had created unusual acoustic or atmospheric conditions that affected both human psychology and animal behavior. A few brave souls, like Professor Blackwood, hinted at the possibility of unknown pathogens or parasites that could be transmitted from bats to humans, causing blood disorders and death. But none of these explanations adequately accounted for the precision of the wounds, the complete exsanguination of the victims, or the historical pattern of deaths stretching back centuries. The case remained unsolved, filed away in the archives of the Royal Irish Constabulary as Incident 1845 M372, Death of Clergy, Cause Undetermined. In the 20th century, the ruins of St. Dymphna's Church became a minor tourist attraction for those interested in Irish history and folklore. The site was purchased by the Irish government in 1923 and designated a protected historical monument. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1960s and 1980s confirmed the presence of human remains in the ground beneath where the church had stood, though by that time the bones had largely deteriorated beyond identification. What remains most disturbing about the Monaghan Church Bats case is not what was discovered, but what was never explained. How could a colony of common pipistrelle bats, creatures that typically weigh 5 grams and feed exclusively on insects, drain the blood from human victims? What was the entity that Father O'Sullivan believed inhabited the bats? Did his sacrifice actually accomplish anything, or did the fire simply destroy the physical vessels the entity needed to manifest? And perhaps most troubling of all, are there other churches, other colonies, other places where something ancient and hungry still waits in the darkness, watching us with tiny eyes, biding its time? The ruins of St. Dymphna's Church still stand on the northern edge of Monaghan town. The walls are crumbling now, covered in ivy and moss. But if you visit on a clear evening and wait until dusk, you can sometimes see bats emerging from cracks in the stones, flying out over the town in search of prey. The locals say they're just ordinary bats, common pipistrelles, nothing more. But they also say that no one has lived within 100 yards of those ruins in over a century and a half. And when children ask why, their parents tell them to hush, to not speak of such things, to stay far away from the old stones. Because some places, once touched by darkness, never quite become clean again. What do you think drove Father O'Sullivan to face this horror alone? Was he a hero who sacrificed himself to save his parish, or did his obsession with the bats lead to his own destruction? Leave your theories in the comments below. And tell us, have you ever experienced something in an old church or historical building that you couldn't explain? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The Monaghan Church Bats case reminds us that history is filled with shadows, with mysteries that refuse to be solved by science or reason alone. Sometimes the line between myth and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. If you enjoyed this journey into one of Ireland's darkest historical mysteries, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker corners of the past. Until next time, remember, the truth is always more terrifying than the legend. See you in the next video.